Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating piece of source material. We're going to objectively break down a historically focused sermon given by the late Allama Saidi. Now, what makes this specific address so incredibly compelling is its central, unwavering thesis. He argues that major political and spiritual victories throughout modern history, they are directly tied to one absolute thing, the complete unity of Islamic scholars. It's a bold claim, right? We're going to look at exactly how he constructs this argument using some super vivid and honestly sometimes pretty surprising historical case studies. Okay, let's dive into this. What happens when rival scholars actually unite? That question right there, that's the core engine driving this entire sermon. Saidi looks at a world where theological and political divisions are just the everyday norm, and he asks, what happens when those divisions are completely put aside? Well, according to the source material, the answer isn't just, say, a peaceful coexistence. No, it's earth-shattering political upheaval. He basically argues that the very second rival scholars unite, the impossible suddenly becomes entirely possible. To actually prove this point, the speaker takes his audience on a bit of a geographical tour. We're going to follow his roadmap, starting with the power of united scholars, then looking at Afghanistan's victory and fall, Iran defying the superpower, Pakistan's MMA coalition, and finally wrapping up with localized tensions with scholars in Bangladesh. So, kicking things off with Section 1, the power of united scholars, and the court thesis. Saidi makes this massive, sweeping claim right out of the gate. Wherever religious scholars actually unite, historic victory inevitably follows. Moving right into Section 2, we hit his first big case study, Afghanistan, victory and fall, and what he calls the unequal war. Now, what's really interesting about this is how he sets the scene. The speaker describes the conflict between the Afghan Mujahideen and the massive Soviet Union as incredibly asymmetric. It's like a newborn baby fighting a giant monster. He points out that the Soviets rolled in with massive modern weaponry, while the Afghans, they were basically fighting with outdated, water-soaked rifles. Yet, against all those odds, the giant Soviet monster was defeated. So how did they pull that off? Well, according to the sermon, before this victory, the level of disunity in Afghanistan was extreme, like almost absurdly extreme. Factions couldn't even stand the sight of each other. They would literally cover their faces with handkerchiefs just to avoid making eye contact. He notes that rivals were declaring each other kafirs, or infidels, for highly specific tallies of reasons, like exactly 3, 5, or 17 reasons. It went so far that if a cow happened to eat grass growing on a rival faction member's grave, that cow was declared an infidel too. So yeah, a truly striking illustration of just total, absolute internal division. Let's trace exactly how this builds into his main thesis. When the war kicked off in 1979, people fled into the jungles and the mountains to hide. And it was there, while in hiding in the 1980s, that these bitterly divided scholars accidentally bumped into each other. The sermon describes this incredibly poignant moment where a guy who's fleeing to his father-in-law's house literally runs into all his rivals in the jungle. In that moment of sheer survival, they suddenly embraced and realized, hey, if we had embraced like this earlier, the Russian ghost wouldn't have climbed on our necks. That accidental unity, he argues, led to 9 straight years of unified warfare in 1989, ultimately defeating the USSR. And this brings us to the stark contrast Saidi draws here. Success against the USSR was entirely driven by the unity of scholars, but the story doesn't end there, does it? He points out that the subsequent fall to the US in 2001 wasn't due to a lack of weapons. Actually, scratch that, it was entirely due to a return to disunity. When the Mujahideen scholars began to suspect each other again, when the greeting stopped and the internal divisions returned, that is exactly when George W. Bush and the U.S. forces were able to just take over. Defeat, in his view, was an inside job born entirely of division. All right, on to Section 3. Iran defying the superpower. Let's look at the Ayatollahs and the embargo. Now, this is a really fascinating pivot, because despite openly acknowledging significant ideological differences with his own audience, Saidi highly praises the Iranian Ayatollahs for their unity. To illustrate this, the source material zeroes in on a very specific historical anecdote. Step 1. America threatens to cut off all food supplies and aid to Iran if 56 American hostages held at the embassy are not released. It was a massive geopolitical threat, right? It was meant to leverage the basic survival of the nation. But then, Step 2, Ayatollah Khomeini issues a response that the speaker holds up as the absolute ultimate example of fearless, unified leadership. Khomeini's reply went exactly like this. Who are you threatening with food? A nation for whom fasting for a month is mandatory will not wait for the food of infidels like you. Saidi uses this super punchy retort not necessarily to endorse Iranian theology, but to demonstrate a broader point. He's saying that when a religious leadership is absolutely, undeniably unified, they completely lose their fear of global superpowers and material threats.
Next up is Section 4. Pakistan, the MMA coalition and uniting diverse sects.
So if Afghanistan was the military example and Iran was the geopolitical one, Pakistan serves as the speaker's ultimate political example of historically divided groups successfully coming together. He highlights the formation of the MMA, that's the Muttahada Majlis-e-Irmal. This was just an unprecedented political coalition. The speaker notes that it literally brought together scholars from entirely different sects, entirely different schools of thought and ideologies under one single unified umbrella. By putting aside their deep-seated theological divisions for a shared political goal, they achieved an electoral victory that, in Saidi's own words, surprised the world. It's his ultimate proof of concept that unity works at the ballot box just as well as it does on the battlefield.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Bangladesh, tensions with scholars in the local context.
This is where the speaker brings his grand global historical thesis right back home to a local, contemporary setting. He completely shifts the narrative away from those grand historical victories and focuses instead on what he perceives as severe, ongoing grievances. The source material presents several very strong claims regarding the environment in Bangladesh at the time. The speaker states that the previous government heavily oppressed religious scholars, essentially treating them as the ultimate enemies of the state and of their own lives. Furthermore, he argues that this wasn't just, political oppression. He claims it was a deep-seated cultural animosity directed toward core Islamic practices themselves, and that this animosity was being systemically encouraged.
To underscore just how extreme he believes this cultural animosity had become, the speaker cites a deeply controversial poem written by a local poet. The quote reads, "When I hear the Fajr Azan, it feels as if a prostitute is calling her customer." Now, to be absolutely clear, we are presenting this quote strictly as Sayedi's cited evidence. By bringing up this highly offensive text, he aims to prove to his audience the sheer scale of hostility that the religion and its scholars were facing. He's framing it as this massive existential threat that urgently, absolutely requires the very unity he's been preaching about throughout the entire sermon. Which really just leaves us with this final thought. Throughout this explainer, we've seen how Saidi masterfully weaves together these huge stories of war, diplomacy, and politics to argue that unity is the single absolute key to power. But it totally begs the question, is the unity of religious scholars the absolute, ultimate deciding factor in a nation's political destiny, just like the speaker claims? Or, when we take a step back and look at the incredibly complex histories of places like Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, is it really just one piece of a much larger, incredibly intricate historical puzzle? It is a fascinating lens through which to view geopolitical shifts in South Asia and the Middle East, and it for sure leaves us with a lot to critically analyze. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning and keep learning.